When the United States Constitution was written in 1787, they included a provision for how to elect the president, which involved something called the Electoral College. Now, modern Americans, many of them don't really understand why the Electoral College exists. And even those Americans who support the Electoral College, they might support it for reasons that were not the original reasons that the framers had for creating it to begin with. So I thought with this video, I'd just explain why the framers of the Constitution created the Electoral College, why they had this be the mechanism for selecting the president. Now, for a little bit of background, the United States originally was 13 separate countries, de facto independent states, that leagued together into a confederation. And they eventually came up with a set of rules to govern their interactions. It was called the Articles of Confederation. Now, during the course of the 1780s, there was increasing discontent with how the system was working under the Articles of Confederation, and many people felt that it needed to be revised or even overhauled and replaced with something different. So most of the states sent delegates to Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, and they wrote a new constitution that would replace the old Articles of Confederation, that would create a more unified country. The states would continue to have their separate identities and would continue to function as governments. But at the same time, there would be a federal government that would be separate from the states and over the states. But it would not simply be a federation of states. It would also be a government that derived its authority directly from the people. The delegates met during the summer of 1787. They gathered together during May. They convened toward the end of May, and then they finished their work in the middle of September. So it was 3.5, almost 4 months that they were hashing out the new Constitution. The new government that they created would have 3 separate branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. And the executive branch, the branch in charge of executing the laws, would be headed by a single individual called a president. And one of the main issues that they discussed that summer was how the president would be selected. The idea of having the president chosen directly by the voters was floated at the convention, and it had its proponents. There was James Wilson and Gouverneur Morris. They were both delegates from Pennsylvania. The Pennsylvania delegation in general was the one that was mainly behind the idea of having direct election of the president. But when they would have votes in the convention on it, the Pennsylvania delegation was always voted down. The other delegates, most of the other delegates who were at the convention, didn't think it was a good idea. And they had several reasons for that. One is they, acknowledging the fact that the United States is a very large country, large geographical area with millions of people in it. You'd have potentially millions of voters spread out over hundreds of thousands of square miles in multiple different states. You can't expect that they would all vote, or a majority of them would vote for a single person. Bear in mind, this was the first time that there was going to be a democratic system operating on such a large geographical scale. There had been democratic systems before this, but they'd always operated on the local scale, local town, democracy on the town level, on the city level, city-state, for example. There were city-states that had democratic systems. But this was the first country that was of such large geographical scope that was going to have a democratic system. So most of the delegates just assumed that having a direct election operating on the entire national level would just be unworkable. You're going to have, tons of different candidates being voted on. Everybody's going to vote for people that they know, and they are mainly going to know people from their own state. So the results would be dozens or hundreds of names receiving votes, and people are generally going to vote for people within their own state. And that would favor the large states, the states with large populations, because people from large population states like Virginia, Pennsylvania, New York, they would vote for fellow Virginians, Pennsylvanians, New Yorkers. None of them would be voting for somebody from New Jersey or Delaware or New Hampshire. And so every president's going to come from a large population state. That's a non-starter for people from the small states. And then another issue that was brought up by Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts was, and I think a few other people may have spoken on this, was that given the fact that the voters are going to be low information voters, they're not going to know lots about people from other states. And by the way, when they were talking at the convention about voting and how people are going to choose the president, they didn't talk in terms of policy. I think people nowadays oftentimes think of you vote for the presidential candidate who best reflects your policy goals. But the way the delegates of the convention were talking about it, they were thinking in terms of voters trying to vote for somebody who think they would have the best character for the job. They'd be the best fit for the job. They weren't thinking in terms of long-term policies and people having policy arguments. So they were thinking, well, how is someone going to be able to evaluate somebody's character? You can evaluate somebody's character if you've been following them in state politics or local politics. So somebody from your own state, you might be familiar with them, you know their reputation, and you know whether you would want to vote for them or not. But somebody from a different state, especially if they're from a distant state where you don't know much about that state, you don't know much about who the leading figures are in that state, how would you be able to evaluate whether the character of that person is, whether that person's qualified? And so Elbridge Gerry raised the concern, well, what if you have some kind of concerted effort? You have some organization that's organized in all the different states, and they organize to have a single individual put forward before all the voters and persuade the voters from different states to vote for this person. And they would be in charge of the narrative about that person. They'd be able to tell people, perhaps misleadingly, about the character of this person and get a bunch of people to vote for somebody who's actually not fit for the job, but who, by getting elected, would be able to use the job for their own profit and the profit of their friends. So they were concerned. Those are the kinds of concerns that were being raised at the convention. How do we prevent bad outcomes? Somebody being elected president who's not actually somebody that the voters would want, but they don't have enough information to know. And so because of that, the delegates defaulted to having Congress choose the president. And this was kind of a natural choice for them. It was the default choice because under most of the state constitutions, which were written in the Revolutionary period in the 1770s, they had their state legislatures choosing the state governor or the state president. Back in those days, some states, the chief executive was called governor, and in some states it was called president. But either way, most of the time, the state legislature chose the governor. There were only a couple states that had popular election of governor, and that was in New York and Massachusetts. And so that was the default. That's what they just naturally went to. The initial working draft for the Constitution that they were working on was called the Virginia Plan. Virginia Plan wrote into it from the beginning what we now call the Congress. The Congress would choose the president. And then the small states with small populations, were disgruntled with the direction the convention was taking, and so they put forward an alternate plan called the New Jersey Plan that had, that was structured a bit differently, but also in that plan, Congress would choose the president. That was just the default position that they kept going back to. And because of that, during the course of the summer, the working draft almost always had the president being chosen by Congress. And there were several reasons why they thought this would be a good idea. For one thing, members of Congress would be familiar with the leading figures in the different states, at least by reputation, if not directly. And so they would be in a better position to be able to evaluate who would be a fit person for the job. Another point that some delegates brought up was, Congress is going to make the laws, and then the job of the president is to execute those laws. So it makes sense to have Congress figure out who they want to be in charge of executing the laws that they are making. Not all the delegates felt that way, but that was another point that was brought up during the convention. The delegates who objected to that objected to it on the basis of the fact that that would mean that you're not keeping a strict separation of the two branches, legislative and executive. And it was important to the delegates that they maintain a separation of the branches. This was an idea that went back to Montesquieu, this idea if you have separation of powers into different branches of the government, then you prevent any one branch from becoming too powerful and therefore becoming a tyranny. And so if you have the president being chosen by Congress, then that puts Congress in the position of being the dominant branch of the government, and the president would just be a creature of Congress. So how do we prevent that from happening? And so they came up with this workaround, or this kind of amelioration for it, where they would have the president serve a really long term and not be eligible for re-election. And the idea behind that was the Congress would choose the president, and then once the president had been chosen and he was in office, he would have plenty of time in office to pursue whatever policy he wanted to pursue, and the Congress couldn't remove him. Impeachment was another issue they went back and forth on whether the president would be impeachable. But anyway, the number they usually had was 7 years for a term of office. Although sometimes some delegates would propose longer terms, like 10, 12, 15 years, but they usually had 7 years as the term of office for the president. They thought that would give the president sufficient scope to be able to pursue whatever policies he wanted to pursue and carry out the job as he saw fit without having to worry about Congress. And then having the president not be eligible for re-election, they thought that was also really important. Because if you have Congress choose the president, and then the president's sitting in that office thinking, if I please the Congress, they'll re-elect me, then he's not really going to be independent of Congress. He's just going to be trying to please Congress. So they made the provision, okay, he cannot be re-eligible. He cannot be, re-electable. Meanwhile, there were 2 features of congressional apportionment that would later have an effect on how the presidential election would be figured out. One was the Connecticut Compromise, and the other was the 3/5 clause. The Connecticut Compromise was a compromise between the large states and the small states, meaning when we say large states, small states, we mean population-wise. So large population states and small population states. The people in the small population states were afraid that creating a closer union of the states would endanger their own independence and sovereignty. They were afraid that large states would take advantage of the small states, perhaps even swallow them up. And so they were determined during the course of the convention to protect the interests of small states at all costs. In fact, the government of Delaware, when it sent its delegates to Philadelphia, specifically told them that they were not to agree to any plan that did not have the states represented equally in at least one of the branches of the legislature, of what would become Congress. Meanwhile, delegates from the large states thought it would be better for congressional apportionment to be based on population, because of the nature of this new government. This new government was not simply going to be a federation of states like the old government was. This was going to be a government that derived its authority directly from the people. The states would still exist, but the federal government would also be its own thing, independent of the states. So the thinking of many delegates was, of course, apportionment of Congress is going to be based on population. The members, the people elected to Congress are going to be elected by the people directly. So this became a big division within the members of the convention, and they were at an impasse for weeks, going back and forth on this issue. And it looked like the small states were going to walk, and that would be the end of the whole project. And so finally they reached a compromise where one of the houses of Congress, the Senate, would have equal representation of the states. And how it ended up being done was each state has 2 senators. And then the other house of Congress, the House of Representatives, would be based on population. So the more population a state has, the more representatives it has in Congress. The 3/5 clause was actually something that was carried over from previously. It had been proposed under the Articles of Confederation. It had not passed, and then they carried it over into in this, a few years later when they had the Constitutional Convention, they brought that idea with them. That's a whole topic unto itself that really needs its own video to discuss. So for now, we're just going to go with the fact that the 3/5 clause held that when deciding on apportionment for the House of Representatives, you count the total number of free people in that state, and then you take the total number of slaves and multiply that by 3/5, or 60%. And that's how you decide how many representatives that state gets. So these 2 features, the Connecticut Compromise and the 3/5 clause, made certain states, small population states and states with large slave populations, more inclined to having Congress choose the president than having a direct election of the president. And like I said, direct election of the president was non-starter. But it also made those states disinclined to having an electoral college. An electoral college was an idea that was put forward by the same delegates that had put forward the idea of a direct election of the president. James Wilson and Gouverneur Morris, like I said, they were the main proponents of having the president chosen directly by the voters. They were also the main proponents of having an electoral college. They saw those two things as going together. They saw the electoral college as the next best thing to popular election. In modern American discourse, we tend to talk about the electoral college as something in contrast to popular election, as something that replaced popular election or usurped popular election, and it takes away people's rights directly to choose the president. That, a lot of Americans talk like that. That's not how it was seen at the time. Wilson and Morris saw an electoral college as something that's kind of an outgrowth of popular election. And the way you can think of it, they didn't talk about it in these terms, at least not that I'm aware of, because I don't think they felt the need to justify an electoral college as opposed to direct election. I think it just was obvious to them. But I think the logic that they were operating under was it's kind of like how we make laws in a democracy. In a democratic government, the people make the laws. That's what a democracy is. But we don't make the laws. I don't make the laws. I don't. I go to the voting booth once every 2 years, and I cast a ballot, and whoever gets elected as my representative, that representative helps to make the laws. The representative represents me and hundreds of thousands of other Americans and makes laws on our behalf. And we don't see that as taking away our rights or taking away our power. That is our power. Our power is to choose who's going to make the laws on our behalf. And I think they thought of the Electoral College in the same way. They thought of the Electoral College as you're choosing electors, and the electors are going to choose the president on your behalf. And it's kind of the same set of issues that are involved. Like, why don't we all just make the laws together? Why don't we all just see a slate of laws proposed? We go online and we look and we see these laws and we decide, we click a box, yes or no. Why don't we make all our laws that way democratically? Why do we have this institution of Congress that stands in between us and the lawmaking? It's because making laws is complicated. We, as individuals, don't have all the expertise. We trust that the person we vote for is, they're going to have a staff. They're going to, be well informed. They spend all day, in theory, studying these laws and studying how they go to hearings, and they spend time in committee and discuss the issue. They do all that because we don't have the time to do that, because we have other things to do. And so we delegate that responsibility to them. And choosing the president is a similar sort of thing, at least from the perspective of 1787, where they were thinking that people aren't going to be familiar with Americans in different parts of the country. They're not going to be able to figure out who's going to be the best man for the job because they don't know all the people. If somebody from North Carolina is not going to know who are the prominent statesmen from New York and Connecticut and Massachusetts who would be best for the job, who has the best character, they're not going to be able to evaluate that. They're not going to have access to the information. But you elect an elector, and then that elector has a few weeks that they, presumably that elector for the first, to begin with, will already be well informed and has a good character and has the best interests of the country at heart. You choose your elector based on their character and also based on how well informed they are about the country. They're presumably somebody who has some, experience with politics. They're familiar with people in different parts of the country. They would be in a better position than a random farmer to know who among all the statesmen in the country is the best man for the job. So the voter delegates that responsibility to the elector, and the elector chooses the president on their behalf. So from the perspective of James Wilson, Gouverneur Morris, they did not see that as any more usurpation of our rights as voters than they would see us electing members of the House of Representatives as a usurpation of our rights to control the lawmaking. They saw it. They saw it in similar terms. So they put forward the idea of an electoral college, and the electoral college would solve some of the issues that pertained to Congress. It would solve the issue of with regard to direct election, in that you solve the problem of low information voters, and people. You don't solve the problem of people only voting for people in their own state. That was still expected to be something the electors would probably do. And on the other hand, though, it would also solve the problem of Congress. Congress, you're open to factionalism, you're open to foreign influence. Those wouldn't happen in Electoral College because the Electoral College forms, elects the president, and then immediately disbands. So there's not time for factions to form. There's not time for foreign governments to try to gain influence over different members of the Electoral College. It also solves the problem of separation of powers because the Electoral College would only exist within the executive branch. So you wouldn't have the problem of the legislative branch controlling who becomes president. It's a totally different institution that's deciding who becomes president. However, the small states and the slave states were still skittish about this. I'm using slave states a little bit anachronistically because there was still some slavery in the North. But by slave states, I mean, the southern states that had large populations of slaves. They were skeptical of the idea of an electoral college. They knew that they had an advantage within Congress of how to choose the president. These other ideas, I think Wilson talked about, having the number of electors be proportional to the population of each state. That wasn't going to fly with the small states and the slave states because they had more of an advantage in Congress. Morris, I believe, put forward an idea of, well, how about we have large states have 3 electors, medium-sized states have 2 electors, small states have 1 elector. Well, that wasn't going to work. So they bandied about this idea of an electoral college, but the majority of delegates never liked the idea, and it was never adopted until September. So like I said, the convention met from May until September. So as it was getting into September, they had been there for 3 months at this point, more than 3 months. They formed a committee that has different names, but it was a committee of 11 individuals, 1 delegate from each state that was currently in attendance. And it was chaired by David Brearly, a delegate from New Jersey. And their job was to take all the bits and pieces of matters related to the Constitution that had not yet been decided and try to hash out a new draft and put that stuff together and then present it to the delegates as a whole for their approval. And so it's at that point that they hashed out an electoral college that would actually be acceptable to the majority of delegates. So what I'm going to do here is read from that section of the Constitution that talks about the selection of the president. And I'm going to go through point by point and show how each aspect of that selection process was designed specifically to address the concerns of some set of delegates at the convention. Each state shall appoint, in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct, a number of electors. So each state shall appoint. That means the states have some control over the election process. There was concern raised by some of the delegates that if the selection of the president has nothing to do with the states, that some of the states won't ratify the Constitution. The states are going to be worried that they're going to lose their existence in this new system, that they'll be swallowed up by a new national government. So they threw this in as a bone toward those states, making the states involved and making the states feel like they have a role in the selection process. And then it continues, a number of electors equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to which the state may be entitled in the Congress. So here's the big breakthrough. The small states and the slave states maintain their advantage that they have in Congress. So they get the exact same advantage in the Electoral College that they get in Congress. The small states get the advantage of the fact that each small state has 2 senators equal to every large state having 2 senators. That's reflected in the Electoral College. And then the slave states would have the advantage of having that 60% of slave population number added to their free population number for purposes of congressional apportionment. That's also going to be reflected in the Electoral College. So that's why it's set up as you take the number of senators that a state has and the number of representatives that a state has, you add that together, and that's how many electors that state has. But no senator or representative or person holding an office of trust or profit under the United States shall be appointed an elector. So that gets to the idea of maintaining the strict separation of the legislative and executive branches. A member of the legislative branch, a member of Congress, is not eligible to serve as an elector. The electors shall meet in their respective states. During the convention, whenever the Electoral College was discussed, it was assumed that the Electoral College would meet as a single body in the national capital. But one of these new ideas that came out of this committee was have the Electoral College meet state by state. So the electors in each state would meet within that state. And that's how it's still done. It's always been done that way. So even today, when electors are chosen, they meet typically in the state capitol, typically in some office in the state capitol building. They'll meet up together and conduct the election process. But by having the electors in separate states, spread out in all the different states, makes it so that, there's less chance of factionalism from happening. There's less chance. It's basically impossible for factionalism to happen because they're not all meeting together. There's hardly any chance for foreign interference. And also, it addressed an issue that was raised. One of the objections to an electoral college was the fact that some states are located far away or will be located far away from the national capital. And it would be more onerous for them to send electors to the national capital simply for this purpose. It's one thing to elect senators and representatives to go and serve in Congress, and they're there permanently or semi-permanently in the national capital. But to have this institution, the Electoral College, which only exists for a few weeks, you elect it, it elects the president and immediately disbands. It would be hard to find people willing to serve in an Electoral College that come from distant states, someplace like Georgia or New Hampshire. And actually, this objection was raised by a delegate from Georgia. But for them, it would be several weeks round trip just to do this one thing. So I think it was Houston from Georgia that was making this objection. You could have a situation where distant states just aren't sending all their electors. Some of the electors won't show up, or maybe they're not able to send electors at all. So they would be disenfranchised in relation to states that are closer to the capital. So this was another way of mitigating that. The electors meet in each state, within each state. So that eliminates that problem. So the electors shall meet in their respective states and vote by ballot for two persons, of whom one at least shall not be an inhabitant of the same state with themselves. This addresses the favorite son problem, the idea that electors would almost always simply vote for someone within their own state. How do you mitigate that? That was another thing that was discussed when they were talking about an electoral college. How do you stop electors from simply all voting for the person within their own state? What you're going to end up with is electors in big states are going to vote for their own, fellow members of that state, citizens of that state. People from small states would do the same. And the president is always going to be someone from a big state. So how do you prevent that? And so the solution that the committee came up with was they choose two electors. You can't stop somebody from voting for somebody within your own state. You may not necessarily want to, but if each elector votes for two people, and one of them has to be from out of state, they'll still vote for their favorite son, but then presumably the other vote would be for someone who is actually well qualified. But then the concern was raised, okay, but then people are just going to throw away their second vote, because they're going to try to get the person from their state elected. So they'll just throw away the other vote. They'll just vote for some random person, right? So how do you stop that from happening? So then they created the office of vice president. And whoever came in second place in the electoral vote count would become vice president. That would incentivize the electors to take both of their votes seriously. And so the idea was probably what would happen is in all the states, electors, one of their votes would be for someone in state. The other vote would be for some prominent statesman that has national stature. And then, so their second vote would be the one who becomes president. And then perhaps, just the person who becomes vice president is a person from a large state or whatever. And if no person have a majority, then from the 5 highest on the list, the said House shall in like manner choose the president, the House being the House of Representatives. One of the things that was discussed at the convention was, does someone become president with a plurality of the vote or with a majority of the vote? And there are problems either way. If it's by plurality of the vote, then you could have a situation where someone becomes president with only 10 or 15% of the vote. And some of the delegates fully expected that that would happen in an electoral college situation because, people spread out over different states and voting mostly for people within their own state and whatever. And they some of the delegates thought it was going to be unusual for there to be people of national stature that a wide variety of electors would be voting for. On the other hand, not everybody, by the way, not everybody did think that. Some of the delegates did think that over time, as the country became more knitted together and there was more of a national culture, that there would be national figures and it would be more likely that electors would vote for a majority. So it wasn't all the delegates that expected that, but some of them did. On the other hand, if you say that someone has to have a majority in order to become president, then what happens when you have nobody gets a majority? What then? Do you have a runoff election or what do you do? So in that scenario, the way they set it up, the backup is to have it go back to Congress, which was the original plan, right? The original plan, the plan they had from the beginning, the original draft, the Virginia plan, the New Jersey plan, the draft, the working draft, all through the summer, it always had Congress is going to choose a president. So what they did is they made that the backup. If the Electoral College can't settle on a majority, then they go to the backup, which is Congress chooses. But not Congress as a whole, rather just the House of Representatives. But then it goes on. But in choosing the president, the votes shall be taken by states, the representation from each state having one vote. So it's chosen by the House of Representatives, but that gives an advantage to large states. So to protect the interest of the small states, they say it'll be decided by the House of Representatives, but each state delegation has one vote collectively. So the New York delegation collectively has one vote, the Pennsylvania delegation one vote, New Jersey one vote, etc. So that was a way of giving an advantage to the small states. Now that they had changed the method of electing the president from having Congress do it to having Electoral College do it, they then needed to address the term of office of the president. It would no longer make sense for the president to serve a 7-year term or potentially longer, but at this point it was just 7 years. 7-year term without possibility of re-election. That made sense with Congress choosing the president. It would not make sense with the president being chosen by the people indirectly by means of the Electoral College. So they shortened the term to 4 years and made him eligible for re-election. Shortening the term was, the idea behind that was that it made him more answerable to the people. The thinking at the time was the shorter your term of office is, the more answerable you are to the people, the more your actions in office reflect what the people want. The longer your term in office, the more independent you are, the more able you are to have some latitude in your judgment. So they went with 4 years to make the president closer to the people, and then make him eligible for re-election to make him motivated to do what the people want. Some of the delegates at the time talked about how if you're eligible for re-election, then you're going to be thinking about how do I get re-elected, right? That was the concern with having the president eligible for re-election when chosen by Congress. You don't want him to be beholden to Congress or trying to please it, but you do want the president to be beholden to the people and trying to please the people. And so you want him to always be able to be reelected. And so the intention was the president would be able to be reelected indefinitely, that he could serve multiple terms. As long as the people wanted him to stay in office, that would be fine. And as long as he has that expectation of he's going to be up for another election, he wants to be reelected, that will motivate him to please the people. Now, I'm curious to hear what you think. Obviously, it was very possible that the convention would have gone with having Congress choose the president. Do you think that would have been a good idea? Would it have been a good idea? Would it have been better to have Congress choose the president rather than have an Electoral College choose the president? How would you have voted in the convention on that issue? And alternatively, given that nowadays many Americans, a majority of Americans, think that the president should be elected through direct vote of the people, if you had been a delegate at the convention in 1787, how would you have tried to persuade your fellow delegates, given the fact that most of them weren't sold on the idea, thought it was a really bad idea? How would you persuade them to go with direct election of the president in light of how people thought in 1787 and how they expected things to develop and how they don't have the kind of hindsight you have? from the perspective of 1787, how do you persuade somebody that direct election of the president would be a good idea? But anyway, I hope that was useful. Thanks for watching.